Hey everybody, I'm Henry Kaiser, and welcome to 5 Hats, where I bring you into my process developing a video game as a producer, designer, engineer, artist, and journalist. Designing a game to be played for more than a few minutes is less about code and story, and more about managing player psychology. You need to offer them a tactical stream of stimuli, feedbacks, objectives, activity options, and milestones, while respecting their agency. So let's put on the designer hat and scope gameplay loops, from seconds in duration to hours. Gameplay loops are a batted around term defined in a myriad of ways, but generally a loop is the sequence of mechanics a player habitually executes to play the game. There are stimuli loops players think about every few seconds, level loops that take the mechanics needed for multiple momentary goals and link them into a larger mental unit, and longer term engagement loops, which contain periodic mechanics players can check in on to invest and plan their progression over multiple sessions. Last week, I introduced game design documents and said a day one task is to write down your core loop. So here's the day one version of my design doc. Each of the mechanics is grouped into separate loops. The contract selection loop contains the mechanics for a player to select a level's goals. The loop Adventuring Day Start contains the running, exploring, dodging, and collecting story elements via interviews and photographs, which has a similar but separate loop called Time Running Out. Once players are off the clock, they can rest and compose their collected story elements into a journalism article before getting scored on it and receiving their rewards, which they can then invest those rewards into more fun ways to play future levels. As a flowchart, it might look something like this. That's a lot of loops. So where do we start? 30 seconds of fun is a unit of looping used by designers at Bungie, the company behind the iconic games Halo and Destiny. When players are in a state of flow,
I live my life 30 seconds at a time.
They need to assess their situation, plan a few actions in line with their short-term and long-term goals, and attempt to play those mechanics successfully. Whether they're looting and shooting in Destiny, or creatively arranging furniture in Animal Crossing, players are thinking about what they want to do about every 30 seconds. So back to basics. Super Mario, every 30 seconds, players are planning routes over gaps, jumping on platforms, defeating enemies, and collecting coins with the goal of reaching the finish with more lives than they started with. In my fantasy action journalism game, every 30 seconds players are considering the story elements they need for their contracted article, and dodging dangers along their way to taking photos and interviews. As I develop the game, I need to nail developing that 30 seconds of fun first. That means development doesn't start by building all of the game loops. Instead, develop the first loop that can consistently deliver 30 seconds, growing with phased rollouts to include more loops over time. There is a shortcoming to the flowchart model of designing loops. It can make the 30-second loop feel disconnected from the long engagement loop. So I want to introduce a different way of thinking, the loop frequency pyramid, and to help us with that is good old Maslow. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, oversimplified, says that in life we have an all-the-time need to not die. And once that base need is met, we can feel safe enough to work our way up to set personal goals, build esteem, self-actualize, and finally transcend to appreciate life itself. I argue gamers have a very similar pyramid. They have an almost constant need to assess changing opportunities and situations so that every 30 seconds they can enjoy themselves and work towards short-term objectives. Completing a few objectives should progressively reward them. These could be extrinsic progression, like leveling up, unlocks, or new abilities, or intrinsic progressors, like a badge that shows they're mastering the game's systems. Now, each progression should introduce new loops or modify existing ones, and over time, the player should see the way that they progressed, recognized and reflected in the game world. What path am I on? What are my relationships between my character and others? What have I shaped, and what investments have I grown? Finally, as a player comes to the end of a game's campaign, either the scripted end or when they've decided to call it quits, we reach a tip of the hierarchy of needs that often gets left out of modern depictions of Maslow's: transcendence, or in gamer terms, fulfillment. What is my story of playing this game? Not just what is the ending, but what would I be if I played again differently? Well, most of us don't expect reincarnation in life. We do talk about games with questions like, would I play it again? If a friend asked if they should play it, what is the fulfillment loop you want to share? If you apply this player's pyramid to the needs of Mario's jump mechanic, you get something like it's most readily on the lookout for pits, then more often power-ups, and rarely but climactically used for final bosses and impossibly difficult combination sections. This pyramid is from a player's perspective, but for a designer's work, it might generically look like this. User interface and user experience at the bottom, providing feedback and nudges, followed by the core loop, local loop, unlocks, economy, and endgame. This designer hierarchy can be used to chart specific mechanics across loops. For example, the interview mechanic in my game. You have the UI helping players ask questions to the beat. Every few seconds, they're searching for who to interview next, and then they're checking their notebook for what info is still missing to accomplish the article's parameters. Every few articles they publish, they're leveling up their interview skills. They can synergize their interview mastery with character relationships to get rare quotes. And all of this is in hopes that one day they'll scoop a legendary interview that earns their article a paradigm-breaking score. While players want your game to fulfill their fantasies, they'll quit before they get there, unless you ensure the foundation of your game is an experience worth looping. Let me know what you think about this pyramid model of gamer needs and designer loops. And if you have a specific role or project you want to ask me about, shoot me a message on LinkedIn. That's all for this episode of 5 Hats. In the next episode, we'll use the artist hat to discuss writing a game about writing that doesn't ask the player to read or write. We'll see you then.